What's up, War Rapport family? We are back with another great edition of Building Rapport, and we got a special guest for you guys today. This guy's no stranger to our channel. We're going to welcome back Josh Pate. Josh, thanks for joining us, man.
Yeah, I got a familiar seat here, so I've got a place to sit when I come now. I know how things work, so there's no reason to have to read the protocol to me anymore. I get it. I'm familiar with this place.
All right, well, welcome, man. I want to jump right into it. A lot has happened in the SEC and in Auburn world. We've had SEC media days. I wanted to get your take on where Auburn stands kind of going into this season after hearing what Harsin had to say about media days. He took Bo Nix and Owen Pappoe with him. Bo got asked questions about, beating Bama. He said, we're not scared of Bama. NIL deals went into effect. How do you think, where do you see Auburn at entering the season? Are we in a good spot?
I've never been one to make much of media days, so let me put that out there first. I make a whole lot more of a single practice report from the first week of fall camp than I do the entirety of media days. So I interpret that whole event maybe a little bit different than a lot of people. I get why it happens, and it has its value, but where Auburn stands, I draw nothing from what is said, because basically Bryan Harsin, just give you an example, Bryan Harsin is who he is. And he is that every day at Auburn. Now, just because a lot of the public gets to hear from him for the first time in Hoover, Alabama, doesn't mean anything changed about him. Same thing's happening with Shane Beamer. I watched Shane Beamer come in and he dropped some cool one-liners. And so all of a sudden you get 14 different articles the following day about how maybe South Carolina's ready to overachieve in year one. Well, nothing changed overnight. It's just people got exposed to it for the first time. So then when you start talking about rubber meeting the road, fall camp opens, and we find out who Bo Nix is and what Mike Bobo can do with Bo Nix and where Auburn is as a program, I've got some cautious optimism offensively. I think offensive line is in maybe as good a position as we could have hoped for it to be in. It's not going to measure up with the best in the country or maybe even the conference for that matter, but I think when we talk about what the biggest fear could have been, worst case with that position group going into 2021 relative to where they are, how can you not like what you've heard so far from whispers and just Bryan Harsin himself? But then where the program is as a whole, I've got a huge question that has not been answered yet about how this program plans to tackle NIL. I'm not asking it alone, but I've watched different programs go about it in different ways. And some of them have chosen to be really bold and out front and with their messaging, and they've partnered with this group and that group. And Bryan Harsin and Auburn really haven't done that. And I'm not criticizing anyone because it's too early in the NIL era to even know who's doing it right and who's not doing it right. But I say that to say I'm very curious because all that obviously ties into your recruiting plan going forward. I'm very interested to see if he's in my living room, if that Auburn staff's in my living room, and I ask, what are you guys doing preemptively to put me in a position to capitalize off my NIL? Are they ready with an 18-point presentation for me? Or do they say, you kind of handle that on your own? We were not really building a huge platform for that. Is it somewhere in between? That's kind of where I'm a little foggy still on the approach they're going to take. And it's really early. They're trying to drink water from a fire hydrant. I get that. And there's been a lot, you got to learn the names on your roster when you get in there. You got to do some really, really ground floor level stuff when you take over a program. And no one's ever taken over a program, obviously, in the midst of all of this stuff happening. Because this stuff, as we call it, it's never happened before, period. So a lot of these new first-year staffs, this last year, they had to deal with no spring because of COVID. This time around, they're having to deal with the beginning of the NIL era. You had obviously the recruiting calendar look totally different this year than it will any other year. So maybe it's that they haven't had time to put together that plan and that messaging, but that's kind of ancillary, but that's kind of the biggest question I have with them off the football field.
Springboarding off of media days, Josh, you talked a lot about we talked about Bo Nix in the past, and we talked about TJ Finley, right? TJ Finley came on to Auburn after spring, and Harsin brought Bo Nix with him to media days, which is a sign that that's one of your guys. That's one of your leaders going into fall camp. And the assumption that we have made is that this job has been Bo Nix to lose in the sense that we expect him to start be the starting quarterback game one. Are you buying or selling Bo Nix's ability to hang on to the position, given a push from TJ Finley that they brought on during the offseason?
I'm going to buy, obviously, well, I guess it's obvious that he starts the season. So I'm in lockstep with you guys there. I think this is, of course, the whole barring injury prerequisite. I think that he's going to hold on to that job all year because I don't think, I could be wrong here, I don't think they're going to run the style of offense this year. And I don't think they're going to put him in positions this year to have any of those meltdown, catastrophic 4 or 5 turnover type games. I just don't think that's the way it's going to look. I think a lot of this really correlates with the depth that I think they can build, even behind Jatarvius Whitlow and behind Shivers when they get, or not Jatarvius Whitlow, Tank Bigsby when they get into fall camp. And so, you know, obviously all this works in conjunction, but if those things happen, if those tumblers start to fall into place, and this obviously works in conjunction with the offensive line that we talked about earlier, if those pieces are there, then I don't think they're going to put him in that position. In other words, I don't think we're looking at an Auburn box score after a game this fall and saying, wow, there's Bo Nix. Let's see, he threw it, what does it say, 53 times this afternoon. I just don't think that's the kind of box score we're going to see. And so because of that, I don't think there's ever going to be that game, even if Auburn loses a few, which they may, I don't think there's going to be that game where there's this gnashing of teeth and it's so blatantly obvious that TJ Finley's got to be put in here. That's not where I see it headed. Now, many things happen every year that I do not foresee in August or even September for that matter. But I don't know, like how, so let's talk this through for a second. So play the devil's advocate, or maybe you guys just outright do expect this to happen. What does the scenario look like if and when the lever is finally pulled?
Okay, so Josh, I definitely want to stick here for a second because that's an interesting thought that he is going to hold on to the job the whole year, and kind of compounding on what you said about them not putting him in positions to have meltdowns. I think sometimes in the SEC, right, the opposing defenses don't give you a chance. So not putting him in positions to have meltdowns means that we're going to be run heavy. That's what I hear, right? And if you're one-dimensional, at some point you got to prove that you have a second dimension. Otherwise, defenses are just going to stack the box and try to stop Tank, right? I see defenses trying to take that away from us. So realistically, what does Bo have to do to make the scenario that you're talking about feasible, where he is not put in positions? What kind of improvement do we have to see year over year for him to not be put into positions where they're trying to stop our run game and they're forcing him to beat them with his arm?
So I think the first thing is be really good on one reads, and that is especially compounded if you have a leaky offensive line at any point in the season, much less the beginning. But I think Mike Bobo has been at this for long enough. He understands how to scheme a first option open. They can scheme one guy open. Now you may have 3 or 4 of them open like Alabama did last year on any given play, but you can get one guy open. That's only half the battle, as we very well know. The second part of it is quick, decisive, 3-step drop, get the ball out and get it there accurately. So you can get a receiver to where you need him to be. Is the ball where it needs to be? And is it on time? So that timing, rhythm, accuracy, if Bo Nix establishes that, and if I'm a defensive coordinator playing him in week 4 or week 5, and I'm looking at that, well, then all of a sudden that plus his legs and his mobility and the ability to scramble on broken plays, then that gives me a lot more hesitation. If that's not there, well, then obviously all this has gone out the window. And if it's not there, then all of a sudden, even if you're that coaching staff, you're looking at that point saying, we don't want to rattle this guy's confidence, but it's equally as important for us to have confidence in him. And we don't have confidence in him right now. And all due respect to Bo Nix, we didn't bring him in. We chose TJ Finley. Now, we've been here since he arrived on campus. We didn't get to choose Bo Nix. We got saddled with him. And so I understand the leash can be short now. I'm not discounting that at all. I think that it is very, very important. That's why when camp's opening, I think that's very important these first few weeks. And we've talked about this both times I've been on with you guys. We have talked about this anytime the name Bo Nix comes up. It is, how much do you have to reprogram him? A lot of that falls on him, man, in these offseason workouts and summer conditioning. It falls on him to get that repetition in, because when you open camp, you don't want to have to be in reverse at all. You want to, even if you're taking baby steps, even if it's just the nuances of fundamentals in this new system, you got to be working forward. You can't waste a day of camp going backwards. and deprogramming anything. So all of that, I think we'll start to get a sense of very early. I don't think we're going to have to wait till the season starts to get a real feel for where he is. If the early returns are language like we're pleasantly surprised or we're more than pleased with where he is, well, number one, you're going to find out how to interpret how this staff talks publicly. But then if they're just on the upright with you, then number two is, I think that's telling you a lot of what you need to know about what they feel like he can do and, you know, how comfortable they are with him and his one read. I don't think they're working him through an entire route tree, 3 and 4 progression type stuff. That's not what they're going to ask Bo Nix to do. I think that would be stupid. Now, at that point, that's not Bo Nix's fault. That's that offensive staff's fault. But if they're not doing that, then, yeah, I feel for the moment, my feet are moving back and forth, but I feel at the moment, on a scale of 1 to 10, I've got about a 3.5 or 4 confidence that he'll make it through the season.
Let's just stay with the offense. When we came out of spring, one of the things that you've mentioned here, I believe, was that you felt that Auburn needed to go into the portal and grab another receiver, right? You didn't see enough in what we had in spring, even with a few guys out who were injured, that Auburn needs to get another guy to add to the receiving core, to add to the competition going into fall camp. They did that. Demetrius Robertson comes over from Georgia. What do you make of him? What do you make of that pickup? And is that who you feel Auburn needs to kind of shake some things up in the receiving core?
Love the pickup. Here's how Demetrius Robertson has always struck me. You've got to be on the ground level to understand some of this stuff, because everyone can look at recruiting rankings and they remember he had 5 stars next to his name. And so because he never really had that breakout year at the college level, either at Cal or Georgia, people default back to his recruiting ranking. It's funny, even when he transferred to Auburn, which feels like 10 years ago, from the time he came out of high school to the time he transferred to Auburn, what did the headline say? Even on my 24/7 Sports, even on our own website, it wasn't Georgia wide receiver transfers to Auburn. It wasn't receiver with X number of career receiving yards transfers to Auburn. It was former 5-star receiver. So we're still categorizing him. I think in the subconscious mind of the average college football fan, you're still thinking Demetrius Robertson, former 5-star wide receiver, which means you're just clinging to and hoping for at least 1 year that meets the potential that we all thought he had out of high school. So the reason I'm teeing it up like that is because if a 5-star guy has not lived up to that 5-star billing by this point, a lot of times the word bust is thrown around. And if it's the word bust being thrown around, then a lot of times you tie it to either injury, which is not really a bust, but you also tie it to character, or he's not a hardworking guy, or, you know, maybe the recruiting services just whiffed. Now, on the latter portion of that, I do think that we got a little drunk on his speed. I'm not on the rankings council, so I'm saying we. I just want all the blame. I want the credit, none of the blame. That's what I want. And so, yeah, I think people got drunk on his speed a little bit, but at the same time, like, he's still got the speed. That hasn't gone anywhere. The thing I want to emphasize is Auburn's not getting some damaged goods from the neck down or barbed wire from the neck up, and now he's their problem. No one's saying that about Demetrius Robertson. Everybody pulls for him. When you talk to folks, to a man behind the scenes at Georgia, he's going to one of their biggest rivals. And even they say, I mean, I hope they lose with him, but I hope they lose while he does a good job for them. So everybody vouches for him. The thing about the situation he's walking into, as opposed to where he's come from, is nowhere he's been needed to lean on him and needed him to shine. If he did shine, that was going to be a great piece to the puzzle, but they already had a plenty big enough picture formed whether Demetrius Robertson really played out of his mind or not. And the reason that's important is because they never really forced the issue with him. Well, now he comes into Auburn, and Auburn is not stacked to the degree that maybe, you know, the Georgia roster would have been this year. And the reason I think that may be important for him is because this Auburn coaching staff may look at him and say, okay, well, we remember all the stars you had next to your name too, and we hear all these people vouching for your character too, and you've been a model citizen for us, and you bought into us. We're going to buy into you, and we're going to force the issue a little bit with you, and we're going to give you a few more touches per game on average than maybe you would have gotten at the other place. Now, here's the follow-up, which is the only question that matters. What are you going to do with it? Which is really exciting for me, just kind of as a bystander, looking at a guy who you pull for, and now you think, at least I think, is going to get an opportunity maybe bigger than he would have had anywhere else. And he's waited his time. It's a little bit later in his career than normal, but you got a guy that still, even this late in his career, could fulfill for 1 year at least that kind of 5-star potential. That's a game changer. You got a guy that's making those kinds of plays that could flip a couple of games for you.
Okay, Josh, the last time you were here, we asked, what does a successful first season look like for Bryan Harsin? You felt pretty strongly last time that his success couldn't really be measured in wins and losses. It's about what kind of product he's going to put on the field. But the landscape is rapidly changing. So I'm going to ask you again, knowing now what the conference may look like in a couple of years, what does Bryan Harsin have to accomplish this year to establish Auburn in the pecking order of what will be a brand new SEC?
In part, I still stick to the answer I gave you, but I'm going to take part of your question because part of your question is my answer. You asked, what does he have to do to establish Auburn in the future pecking order? Well, establishing Auburn is what he does have to do. And that's not determined by whether you win 7 games or 8 games your first year. Like, that's going to be what it is. To me, when we come out of 2021, and then we assume now, we don't really have to assume, we know where this conference is headed. And we know it's going to be more crowded on this block, maybe next year, but easily a couple of years down the road. It is imperative, always is, but now more so than ever, to do just that, to establish Auburn. So what we're talking about here, the reason I mentioned NIL a couple of minutes ago and the reason I'm talking about phrases like establish Auburn is because if you've ever, I don't go to the mall much anymore, but like, remember when you used to walk through the food court at the mall and there are 50 million voices, but you can't make out any one voice. You just hear a bunch of noise. That's the SEC. The SEC is the food court at the mall. You've got to be able to establish your voice and make it stand out above the crowd. And it doesn't always have to be the exact same way that Alabama or LSU or Texas A&M does it, but it's got to be something different and something unique. Now, Malzahn had something unique when he was at Auburn. I don't necessarily think in the world of recruiting it stood out to the degree that maybe as an Auburn fan you would want it to, but there was something unique about Auburn. That has to start to take shape for whatever Auburn's going to be under Bryan Harsin. No one knows that, man. Even if you have day-to-day access to that program, that coaching staff, they don't truly know what they're about to turn into. Now, unlike us, they may know what their master plan is for what they want to turn into. But establishing Auburn, whether it's 7-5 with 5 one-possession losses or 8-4 with 4 blowout losses, I take the 7-win scenario over the 8-win in that trajectory any day. Do you establish something? Do we get some of those answers to the questions about how they're going to handle NIL, for example? Do we start to enter the 2023 recruiting cycle, seeing them gain a much better foothold in state? Do we see the relationship start to gel? Do you start to get feedback from high school coaches on the recruiting trail, both on the record and anonymously? And they say, it was kind of frosty when the staff first got here, but now they've got their feet under them, and they did fill in the blank in the 2021 season. And now, they're a lot more inviting. We're on campus a lot more. I hear from them a lot more. We've saturated the recruiting market now, and it's good to go. And now they're going to go heads up with some of the big boys. That's the kind of language. And that's why I know it sounds very passé to say, oh, I don't so much care about record. No, I care about record, but I'm not married to record as the end all be all to answer this specific question.
So we're starting to ease our way into this, the conference realignment talk and the SEC expansion. I want to know from your opinion, when you assess the landscape of the SEC, we know who the major players are. We know who the guys who want to be the major players, who they are. And then there's Oklahoma and Texas. Well, once they finally come over to the conference, where do you see Auburn fitting into this new puzzle? Where does Auburn stack up in this new SEC, in your opinion?
2 questions that you have to ask even before this. Number one, neither of you are going to be able to answer them, so they're rhetorical. How long is Nick Saban hanging around? Because that really impacts everyone. So if we get that answer, then that would help me. Number 2, and this is more real and more immediate, what's going to happen at LSU this year? Because there are only so many wins to go around this conference. Yeah. And you've got a guy that's 24 months removed from winning one at LSU. You got a guy who wins one every other year at Alabama. And you got one on the precipice at Texas A&M, and you got to play Georgia every year too. So Georgia and A&M kind of in the same boat in that sense. It's I want to be careful how I answer this, because it's really hard when you've watched a staff that has never coached a game yet and you're trying to ask where are they going to be. As a program, where Auburn's going to be is very much in flux for now a couple of reasons. And one of them is a new staff. And number two, can anyone answer with crystal clear certainty the position that this athletic department's going to be in this time next year? Everyone's still going to be there? Everyone going to be in the same positions they hold right now? And so that's not the concern of the average fan who just tunes in on Saturday, but yet the average fan's product that they watch on Saturday is obviously tied to what we're talking about right now. And you're getting a little more in the weeds, but I'm not doing my national show right now. I'm doing an Auburn show, so we can talk about this stuff.
Yeah.
All of this is very important. And all of this, it's critical because you've got just freight trains with 70 cars all moving the same direction at several other places. And then you got 2 others coming in. Oklahoma's already there. Texas, I can promise you, if they don't see pretty immediate returns from Sarkisian, that'll be one of the shortest leashes you've ever seen. Because if you think those people are about to come into the SEC and experiment at head coach, you're crazy. And so you're going to have shark-infested waters, the likes of which no conference has ever seen in the history of this sport. You can't be anonymous, and you can't have trepidation, and you can't be uncertain about who's going to be in what position this time 6 months from now. You can never afford to be that, but even more so in the future of the SEC, you can't afford to be that. So where is Auburn going to be? It's directly tied to the answers to those questions. And yet again, we have asked a future-facing question, and I have not even mentioned their record this year, which shows you how relatively insignificant I think their specific record this year is in the whole grand scheme of things.
Okay, Josh, you did a pretty good dance there. I can appreciate that. But we didn't invite you to be careful, so I'm going to circle back around and ask another question. In light of, because we've interviewed some of the people that you're talking about, right? And he talked about budgets and coaches and everything when he came on our show. Now we're hearing some chatter that some of the coaches down there are not happy with how he's running things. They're not happy with their budgets. They're not happy. But he did go out and pulled a big boy move, and he hired Bryan Harsin. So in light of what you're saying we have to establish, what does it look like if, and I'm not sunshine pumping here, but if Bryan Harsin comes out in year 1 and does something like win 10 games, does that whole situation settle down? And what does that do for Auburn? I know that you're not measuring it necessarily in wins and losses, but I do think that the bottom can fall out if he comes out and has a losing record and we look bad in some of those losses. But if conversely, he goes on the road and wins at LSU for the first time in 2 decades, right? And he opens the SEC with wins against, 2 schools who, quite honestly, we haven't beat very much over the last 10 years. Does that extend some grace at the top? And does that maybe lend to some more foundational security?
All right, so you're doing something that's pretty rare. You're kind of talking me off my own argument. All right, I'm starting to change my mind. So it may very well be that record is more important this year for Allen Green's purposes, at least.
For sure.
So there's a little bit of a different avenue there than we have talked about. So I'm thinking out loud, and this can be a scary thing for me. So I'm thinking out loud here. When Chip Kelly got to Oregon, he was doing something radically different. When Gus Malzahn got to Auburn, they were doing something so radically different that it took their leagues by surprise. It was like a slap to the back of the head of those leagues. And those guys, especially Malzahn at Auburn, he was able to have immediate success. Now, it wasn't necessarily indicative of what we should expect down the road, but he had immediate success. He has nothing else in common with Bryan Harsin. So the comparison ends there, but it's anecdotal in that if Bryan Harsin were to have a lot of success this year, I don't see any smoke and mirrors way that happens. So what I'm saying is if he overachieves this year, if they were to win 8 or 9 games this year, it would just be meat on the bone. I mean, it would be legitimate. I don't know how you could look at it any other way. Is he going to sneak some secret offense into the league that we've never heard of before? I don't think that that's going to be the case. So yes, absolutely. But here's the other side of that coin. And the more you think it through, we haven't seen any movement at athletic director. We've heard the rumors. Everyone's heard the rumors. But it may very well be that a lot of people are sitting back and they're on that rocking chair on the front porch and they got their arms crossed and they're saying, just wait, football season will make our argument for us. And they're counting, and I wouldn't put this past some people down there, they're probably counting on an inferior product on the field this fall so that they can use that as that last round of ammunition they need to bring it to the forefront and say, well, we let you get your way, even though this isn't a fair argument. They may make it anyway. We let you get your way. This is the product that it put on the field for us. What happens on this field is the fabric of this community. Make no mistake about it. And so that may very well be the case. It may be that even though Auburn football over the long haul may not be married to the record this year, the leadership currently at Auburn may absolutely be married to whatever that record ends up being this year.
So, Josh, let's refocus and talk about Oklahoma and Texas coming to the SEC. Before we talk about the impact that this is going to have across the college football landscape, let's talk about how this changes the SEC in terms of coaching. How much tougher did some of these jobs get in the SEC, in your opinion? Like, how much tougher did it get for Mike Leach or Kiffin at Ole Miss, given that if things shake out the way that we think, the SEC West, which is already one of the toughest or the toughest division in all of college football, may have gotten just as tough, even if Auburn and Alabama moves east. How much tougher did some of these jobs get, or how much more attractive did these jobs get, in your opinion?
It depends on what you value. And this had already started to happen in the SEC. You had already started to see some examples like Billy Napier, for example, turning down some SEC jobs. And he wasn't the only one. Maybe publicly he was, but he has not been the only guy who has turned down some of these SEC jobs. So you either had one or two reactions to that. You either looked at it and said, you're crazy, they were going to double your salary and you get to coach in the SEC, or you looked at it and said, well, the landscape's changed. Ryan Day, Kirby Smart, Lincoln Riley, those guys have shown you can have your first job at one of the 10 best jobs in America. Whereas on the other side of things, Chad Morris showed if you just jump at the first SEC job that comes along, you may be so hung out to dry career-wise, you got to jump into the Texas high school scene to get yourself back on track. And so now you make the water even deeper and you bring Texas and OU in, and that resource gap is not going to shrink. You may have more net revenue at Mississippi State, but as yours goes up, so too does the one at Alabama, so too does the one at LSU. So you're not closing any gap on them, and it would be foolish to think otherwise. So I actually think what we could see, if we're not very careful, is a widening of the gap that exists in the SEC, because I think that clientele and representation agents out there are going to start to circle jobs like an Ole Miss or like a Mississippi State or like an Arkansas in the future. And they're going to tell their A or B list clients that get offered from maybe the G5 level or as a high profile coordinator, nope, we're not taking those. I know how big that paycheck looks, but we're not taking them because I view it as totally unrealistic that you could ever go in there and compete. And your record is going to not be indicative at all of who you are as a head coach, but it's not going to matter. Because I can't go to a bigger program and say, yeah, I know he's going 5-7 every year, but he's really like a 9-4, 9-3 type coach. He's just in shark-infested waters down there. That's not the way that works. So the net impact, I think, is going to end up being a widening in the coaching quality down here, a widening, and that there's going to be, whereas there may be a ditch or like a 2 or 4 lane road right now, there's going to be a canyon over time if it goes the way I think it will, between the haves and have-nots from a coaching standpoint.
What does Texas look like in the SEC? Because we know what they look like in the Big 12. Some would argue that they almost destroyed their own conference 10 years ago. And now they're coming to the SEC. What happens to the Longhorn Network? Are they going to be able to be just another player in the bigger picture rather than being the whole picture? How do you see that playing out?
I think you're saying the words Longhorn Network for the last time. That'll be a memory in the not too distant future. Yeah. So that'll just be the answer to a trivia question 5 years from now. But as for what Texas is going to, sorry, I mean, it will be. But as for what Texas is going to be and where they're going to stand, this is the most fascinating part of this to me. aside from just the on-field competition, the most fascinating part is, and what I've been talking about with Texas A&M is, you guys are so shell-shocked by being in the shadow of Texas, because that's exactly what you are, or were rather, for a long time, in a conference that allowed, it kind of allowed the landscape to be artificially tilted towards Texas, because the weight of Texas, it carried that. It carried weight, and they were able to throw that weight around. This conference, man, in the SEC is built totally different. This conference has the ability to look at a brand even like Texas and say, if you want to come, fine. If you don't, fine. It's like Nick Saban recruiting Julio Jones back in the day. I'll win with you. I'll win without you. So make up your mind. I got a spot here if you want it. That's kind of how the SEC can be with Texas. Of course, the Big 12 can't. They would fold entirely, like they're about to do, like an accordion once they lose Texas. But that's not the question you asked. You asked, how's Texas going to process this? And what I think they're doing is saying all the right things to get in the club, all the while whispering to each other and texting each other on the side. Oh, once we get in there, don't worry. Once they see what we're all about. And I don't think that's the way that's going to work. The logo will be important now, just as the Georgia logo carries more weight than the Kentucky logo in football. Oh, it'll be more important. But see, the vote that Kentucky has on matters equals the vote Georgia has on matters around here. And the vote that Texas will have on matters equals the one A&M will have on matters. And so they're going to have to win based on merit. They're going to have to achieve or fail based solely on merit down here. Now, that is not a losing proposition for Texas. That formula alone still gives them a massive advantage, but they've already had one and squandered it, which is why coming to the SEC, the task only gets harder because the spotlight gets brighter, the pressure gets ramped up, the Saturday in, Saturday out competition level infinitely goes up. That's why I don't think there's going to be a long leash on Steve Sarkisian, man. He didn't have, now I don't feel sorry for him. No one feels sorry for him, but I mean, they cannot afford to be running experiments and slowly breaking in a head coach and, letting him reintroduce himself onto the head coaching scene. You can't do that around here, man. You miss out on a bowl game while you're doing that. And you can't do that at Texas. So
to follow up that, the Texas Board of Regents voted 8-1 for conference expansion. I don't believe for a second that that's really how they all felt. How much does Texas A&M hate this move right now, despite how their Board of Regents voted?
They hate it. I mean, I don't think that's any great mystery. And I have sympathy and frustration, or I have empathy and frustration, I guess, because I don't doubt I'd feel the same way if I were in their position. I think anyone who says otherwise is kidding themselves. If you were in the position they'd been for a long time and you got out of it and you thought you were waving goodbye to this nightmare that's been by your side forever in the rearview mirror, and then they just show up, they take the idea you had and they say, oh, never mind, we're going to follow. Like that's like when your little sibling used to copy you when you were younger. Yeah, you hate that, man. Or you're older. Imagine your older sibling doing it. That's even worse. So yes, I get the frustration, but that's the empathy. The frustration comes when I don't think Texas A&M fully understands what they're capable of and how valuable that 9-year head start has been for them. They've come over here and that program is on a level it's never been before. There is no box that you have to check to be able to win a championship that they can't check to the 98th percentile in this country. And they've got the money, and they've got the power, and they've got the recruiting base, and they've got immaculate facilities, and they've got an fully invested, if they weren't already, they are now, fan base and administration. They top to bottom administratively mirror all these other big-time annual contending programs. The only difference is because they haven't had a stud quarterback, they haven't won a playoff game. They haven't gotten in there. They haven't won a title yet. But they are capable of it any given year now. And I don't think a lot of them fully realize it. I think a lot of them believe when Texas comes back over here, it's going to be the Big 12 all over again. And it's not. If they start losing to Texas, if they retake that inferiority position relative to Texas, it's only going to be because they let it happen. In the Big 12, there were external forces working against them. Here, it's all on you.
But let's talk about the national landscape of college football with this move and the idea that the pieces may not fully have fallen into place. There's speculation that the SEC may not be done, but let's just talk about the conference as is and how that can affect. You have the college playoff expansion, going to 12 teams. You have other conferences. You don't know you don't know if the Big 12 will be cannibalized by other conferences. In your opinion, the direction of where this is heading, do you see this as a positive, or are you cautiously optimistic, or are you concerned with the direction of where we're heading as college football?
I don't like it at all. I'm very concerned about it. But again, I'm not a fan of a team or a conference over the sport. I'm a fan of college football. That's how I grew up. I mean, I love the sport, and I love it because it is unique unto anything else we have. And it's unique because there isn't perfect congruency. Every conference isn't the same size. You know, one's independent up here, and one of them plays 9 conference games, and one of them plays 8 conference games. And it's a beautiful thing. The nuance of college football and the tradition and pageantry, that's a beautiful thing. Unfortunately, a lot of the checks and barriers and balances that we have had artificially built into the sport that kept it from professionalizing itself from a model standpoint have inevitably started to be eroded because the wrong people have their hands on the steering wheel of college football. Now, none of us really in and of ourselves have power to change that. The only real way you change it is turning the games off, and we're not going to stop watching. So, I mean, I'm telling you right now, I'm not going to stop watching, but I don't have to endorse what's happening here. And I think it's very foolish for some out there. This is what aggravates me the most, to be honest with you. When you speak up and you bring kind of what I think is logic-based fact and reasoning to counterpoints or pushing back against these changes, there's this group out there that takes delight and think they're taking an intellectual high ground on you when they say things like, well, you better just get used to it because money rules the day and it's changing whether you like it or not. Like, I don't see that. And like someone with a fully functioning brain can't already see that. It's not that you've spotted something I haven't spotted. It's not that you've realized something that little old naive me hasn't come around to realize. I get it. Probably got it long before you did in all likelihood. I just don't like it. I don't endorse it. I feel the same way with a lot of the playoff proposals out there. I am a believer that it's okay if there's a little arguing at the end of the year. That's not the worst thing in the world. That's not ripping your sport apart. And likewise, it's okay if there are portions of the country that any given year may not matter as much as any other year. That's just the natural ebb and flow of college football. It's always been that way. I am telling you, I can't prove this, but I'm telling you, all of this stuff eventually flows back to Nick Saban and the impact the guy's had on the sport. Because the impact he had on the sport started with trying to find a way to make sure 2011 didn't happen again. And so somehow you're going to expand a playoff to ensure that there's not an SEC on SEC matchup in a title game. Well, that didn't work out. And then you change the recruiting rules, and then you change the 1 yard versus 3 yard. You don't keep the same rules NFL to college when it comes to offensive linemen downfield. And everything is being done, hopefully, to such a way that you can pull him back down. You can pull that Alabama product back down, and none of it works. None of it's ever worked because you're not going to restrict or plate greatness. You never are. I'm a believer that if I did nothing more than just remove him from the last 10 years, if he came into Alabama, stayed 3 years, went back to the pros, I believe we'd have a sport that in a lot of ways looked pretty similar to what we had a decade ago. But instead, you've had a lot of measures because you got a lot of people that blame the system for their inadequacy, or they blame the system for what actual greatness has produced at one place disproportionate to other places. And they've gone about trying to reverse engineer the sport and get rich in the process. And they've convinced enough people to buy along with it and go along with it that you're finding out what it means to be on a slippery slope now. And the reason some of us pushed back so hard at the beginning is because the nature of a slippery slope is once you're on it, you never find your footing until you get to the bottom. And I don't even know what the bottom is, to be honest with you, but I feel like we're on the slope now.
Okay, so when conference expansion got mentioned, Greg Sankey issued a statement, and I'm paraphrasing here, that essentially says we're not seeking out to expand, but we're open to things when they happen. I don't think anybody actually believes that, and there's a popular idea that these talks have been going on for months and months, and just now coming to the head, and that even another network was involved in pulling some strings to make this happen and kind of destroy the Big 12 at the same time. What is your opinion on all of that? And then my next question after that is, does this make Greg Sankey like the most powerful guy in college football now?
Well, let me work in reverse. Yeah, he's the most powerful guy in college football. And if anyone doubted it, I think they see it now. I will say this, though. I, unlike most, am actually taking him a little bit more at his word right now as it relates to the strategy of the SEC. I know what the worst fears are out there. I echo them. The worst fears are SEC is not going to stop till they have a super league, 30 teams, 32 teams, whatever the case may be. I talked to someone pretty informed about this over the weekend, and they said, rest assured that if they wanted to do it, they could do it tomorrow. So if that's what their goal is, then there's no reason for them to stop unless they're just taking a breath right quick and then diving right back in. There are big time member institutions that want in this conference that are at least temporarily being shown that slow down. Nope, not right now. And so there's something holding the SEC up from immediately going down that road. Now, maybe that's where we eventually get. And in that case, I will willfully remain naive until the bitter end. But I do believe that, there's a little bit different tact being taken. And I think they're okay with hanging out at 16 for a while. And I do believe also Greg Sankey, when he said what he said about we weren't looking to do this, but the opportunity presented itself to us. I'm not so sure that that's not how that happened. Now they were more aggressive maybe than he led on to believe. But I really don't think that they were sitting there in Birmingham, Alabama, just starved out of their mind to expand the conference footprint. And they just begged and beat on the door in Norman and Austin until someone finally answered. I don't think that's the way that went at all. Having said that, here's what I hope. What I hope is they do stop at 16 for a little while. And I hope, therefore, the Big Ten may counter, but the ACC is able to stand and the Pac-12 is able to stand. And even if the Big 12 can't, and I don't think they can, because I think there's coming a day in the not too distant future where we're not just talking about ESPN, Fox, ESPN. I think there's coming a day very soon, whether it be through major corporate merger, which could happen, some whispers, or just a big streaming giant deciding to take their quadrillion-dollar market cap and get into this game where there are more media partners at the table. And that means there's more media cash in the market. And it all of a sudden means that the SEC's deal with ESPN isn't choking the financial lifeblood out of the rest of the market, therefore disproportionately negatively impacting all these conferences. If you can hang on, if you're the Pac-12, for example, and you can hang on until 2024, 25, 26, what if Amazon announces that we're about to heavily invest in live college football? We are going to immediately prioritize partnering with a conference, and we are going to do for a conference what we know to be the SEC and CBS over the last X number of years. If that happens, that alone is a game changer, and there's no skill in predicting it because that kind of stuff is not known until the day it's announced. So for all we know, those wheels are turning right now, but that's why I don't make definitive statements on this stuff, because we see the tip of the iceberg. 90% of what's going on, you will never hear and you will never see. But if you could, it would provide a lot more context to what we do hear and see.
Well, Josh, as always, we appreciate you joining us to talk a little Auburn football, and in this case, SEC expansion, which I know will be a hot topic headed into the season. So thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Well, as always, we are the War Rapport. If you want more content like this, please click like and subscribe. We are the War Rapport on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. TW Rapport on TikTok. Gentlemen, we're signing off. And as always, War Eagle.